So again, it's with great pleasure that I welcome all 8 of them. I don't even know who's going to start, so I'm going to hold out this microphone, and I know one of them will grab it.
John, thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you for all the amazing work you've done to make this series and so many other things work. I'm going to talk for a few minutes before the rest of the crew takes over, and they've asked me to sort of just kind of set the backdrop for this work we've been doing in the last few years. And I'm happy that John described us as revolutionaries. In some other sense, I think more and more all the time that we're deep conservatives, that we're working extremely hard. This number 350, the most important number in the world, as we've styled it, is in many ways a remarkably conservative idea, that it would be nice to retain the world in something like the shape that we found it when we were born. The number, as you know, comes from a number of scientists now, most notably Jim Hansen and his team at NASA, who said in January of 2008, in the abstract of the paper they published, said that any value for carbon in the atmosphere greater than 350 parts per million was not compatible with the planet on which civilization developed or to which life on Earth is adapted. We like civilization, life on Earth, and those other things. So our work is all about trying to maintain in some way that planet that we once knew. We're going to talk about our particular part of the solution, which is less the set of very strong economic ideas that you've heard from people like John and Bob Costanza, less the particular technological solutions that you've begun to hear people. Our bottom line always, our solution, our team's work is about organizing. About creating the political conditions that make it possible to do any of the other kind of work. It's very clear that we have to get the price of carbon right, that we have to invest a lot of money in new technologies in order to allow them to blossom, that we have to set caps on carbon, that we have to do a long list of things. We have to build lots and lots of wind. But it's also very clear that we won't do any of these things until there's enough political momentum, enough political thrust to make them happen. That they're not going to happen on their own simply because they're the logical, rational, obvious thing to do. They won't happen because there's enormous inertia in this system that makes it difficult for it to change. And they won't happen because there's very powerful and active opposition on the other side. The fossil fuel industry is the most profitable industry in the world by a large measure. ExxonMobil made more money in each of the last 3 years than any company in the history of money. Okay? That means that they're not going to change easily, and they haven't changed easily. In this country, we've had a 20-year bipartisan effort to accomplish nothing, and it's been entirely successful. You saw that much the same was the result of Copenhagen in December. So unless we're able to build new political momentum, any of the solutions that we talk about are mostly talk. And that's what our work's been about. To give you the littlest bit of background, we started 3 years ago with this march across Vermont that ended a mile from here in Burlington at 1,000 people. At the time, it was the largest demonstration that had yet taken place in the United States about global warming. That seemed to us a bad sign, that we needed a movement, that we had the superstructure of the movement, the scientists, the economists, the policy people. What we didn't have was the movement part of the movement, something to give it heft and power, maybe to put a little fear into some of the political leaders. So we began building in the United States, and in the spring of 2007, we did this thing called Step It Up, that organized 1,400 demonstrations across the United States, the biggest thing of its kind ever in the United States, and in many ways was successful within a few days of its conclusion. Both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, then running for president, changed their energy and environment platform to reflect the demands that we were making for large-scale cuts in carbon emissions. We were feeling good about that until a few weeks later in the summer of 2007 when the Arctic began rapidly to melt, and it became very clear that global warming was happening more quickly than scientists had anticipated, and that not only were our old targets largely out of date and obsolete, but so was the idea that we would solve this one country at a time, that instead we were going to have to work as a globe if we were going to work at all. And so we decided to try to do global scale organizing. In many ways, a ludicrous idea. People don't really do it. The globe is a very large place. People around it insist on speaking different languages. The gulf between rich and poor, always a sin, is also an incredible practical impediment to reaching agreement on what kind of changes we need to make, because the world looks entirely different if you're a very poor peasant living someplace back and beyond, or if you're living in the suburbs of Burlington. Nonetheless, we figured that we would need a kind of rallying cry to have any hope of doing this, and so the thing that we picked was this number that NASA had provided, 350. On the one hand, it was a hard organizationally address the problem. Two, because it turns out that Arabic numerals are the one thing that translate easily across linguistic boundaries. This slide means the same thing in Beijing and in Burlington and in Barcelona and in other places that begin with B that I'm not thinking of right at the moment. Burundi, where we had an excellent demonstration. Our organizing around the world last year was focused on a single day, October 24th, in the run-up to Copenhagen and the conference. And the only goal of the entire year was to take this number from nowhere and put it on the map, to make as much of the world as possible understand that this was the most important number, with the hope that that might have some real effect in terms of changing political attitudes. And so that's what we did. And that day, that sort of weekend of October 24th, technology is not my strong suit. I'm going to start pushing buttons here and see if some pictures begin emerging of that day. To cut to the chase, we didn't know how well this was going to work right up until the last minute, but the bottom line is it worked awfully well. Over the course of that 36 hours as the sun moved from around the world that Saturday, we had 5,200 different rallies, demonstrations, and protests and things in 181 different countries. CNN said it was the most widespread day of political action in the planet's history on any topic of any kind. One of the subtexts, just to keep in mind for those of you in this room, is that none of us, and the reason I've sort of been telling you this story is to make the point that none of us really, when we began this a couple of years ago, had any idea of what we were doing. And we didn't have anything in the way of resources, and we still don't have much in the way of resources, but we were able to, and y'all are able to, do things on a large scale now because of some of the tools that we have, because of some of the possibilities. It's an exciting moment. Pictures, one of our organizing techniques, one of the things we wanted to do from the beginning, we did it with Step It Up, but even more so with this, was to make sure that we had visual images pouring in from around the world so that everybody could get the sense of momentum. And so the day begins in New Zealand and moves across the Antipodes and into Asia. And every place people are coming up with just remarkable, beautiful ways of getting these numbers across. One of the things that you need to think about as you look at these pictures is understanding that the old canard, the old idea that environmentalism was something for rich white people, is no longer true. Most of the pictures, most of the faces that we saw, and there's 25,000 pictures now in our Flickr account if you want to go check it out for yourself. It's all online. It'll take you a little while. But most of the pictures we saw were of brown, black, poor, young faces, because most of the people in the world are brown and black and poor and young. And not only are they most of the people in the world, they're the people most immediately at risk and at peril. And I mean, Bangladesh is a country already seeing huge outbreaks of dengue fever, climate refugees leaving the coastline as fields become salinated, on and on and on. Place after place like that all over the world. People taking these numbers and making them real. We had hundreds of demonstrations across India. Will Bates will talk a little later, who organized India, but in a way that it hadn't been before, which is very good, because along with China, India and the U.S. are, those are the big three in terms of potential carbon output into the atmosphere. Some of them were in very poor places. Here's the Congo, someplace along the Congo River near Kinshasa. They didn't have a digital camera. They got this developed. It didn't come out so good because, the chemicals were older. So they wrote on their banner what their banner had said and managed to get it to us. Very far-flung places. We had many, many places where people were underwater that day. 350 divers on the Great Barrier Reef, underwater. I don't know if there's a picture of the underwater cabinet meeting in the Maldives that the government held, on and on and on. Places where organizing is supposed to be, should be sort of difficult, but Istanbul had had the worst flooding they'd ever experienced 6 weeks before October 24th. There were 10 or 15 big demonstrations in Istanbul alone. We'd done a big climate training camp in another part of Turkey earlier in the year for people from across Central Asia, and they really did an amazing job. Just place, that's from the top of the Space Needle in Seattle. Those are the colors of the Venezuelan flag. That's just a nice picture from Tahiti. Lots and lots, as you'll hear later, lots and lots of involvement of artists. Something that began very much, where's Cammie? Began very much with our first march across Vermont, when we made art at the center of the stuff that we were doing, and to this day continuing. Big involvement from faith communities. This is in South Africa. This is the leader of the Muslim communities of South Africa, animist traditions. That's the Anglican Archbishop. Desmond Tutu's replacement is Anglican Archbishop of South Africa. I like that picture because they're incredibly cute, and because I like the name of their foundation. The perfect example environment. But just things happening in places that no one had, I'd never heard of. Tema in Ghana is apparently a pretty big town, but I'd never come across it. Concentrating constantly on this number, trying to drive the science into the debate, okay? And so some places we did giant 3s, and some places that's London, giant 5, and I think that's Copenhagen, yes, the giant 0. And then making that night, the BBC and CNN and whatever, put them together, making the point that we've got to work across borders to make this happen. We had, as you'll hear, exquisite luck with press coverage, part of which is always luck. Nothing else happened that day of note. So we owned the world's newspapers, and on Google News, we were the top story on Google News for a good 24 hours, with thousands and thousands, and most newspapers around the world had a picture like one of these across its front page the next morning. We specialize in thinking about iconic places that'll make people in various countries really, and so in India might be that, and it was a fall Saturday in the United States, so college football stadiums were important. That's at Syracuse, every place you can think of that has a kind of resonance. And we were able to organize in places where people really aren't supposed to be able to organize. There were 300 demonstrations across China. One of them got broken up by police, but the other 290 whatever went off beautifully, thanks to Jamie Henn, who you'll meet in a little while. Just on and on and on. And again, with that powerful artistic sense, getting across not only the danger, but also the kind of human beauty and creativity and passion and love that needs to be a large part of the solution to whatever we're doing here. We were hopeful that we'd be heard in Washington. We were hopeful we'd be heard throughout the culture, and we were. One of the things that we didn't do on purpose was to have the involvement of celebrities. The only celebrities really this day around the world were scientists. And for a moment we were trying to say there's something more important in our culture than the things that we usually worry about, and it doesn't seem to have interfered with the kind of press coverage and things that we got. The 8 of us that day were in Times Square in New York for a kind of, not a huge rally. We only had a permit for a couple hundred people, right, May? Something like that. But we had all those Jumbotron screens that are normally advertising vodka or cigarettes or whatever, were instead flashing pictures from all over the world behind us as we were talking, and it made great visuals for the evening news, but it also allowed people all over the world, okay, to feel as if, and it was when I was traveling around the world in the year before, telling people about this, they're all like very excited that their picture from their village in Senegal or, you know, their village in the hills of Lebanon or whatever was going to be up on these screens in Times Square. They understood the kind of unifying, that's the top of the highest mountain in the Antarctic. There we have a whole file of pictures, hundreds of pictures that's just labeled 350 adorable. That has many, many, many young people with large eyes, you know, involved. And so many of them in places that you're not supposed to be able to organize. We have another file. I mean, to just kind of shake up people's sense of who's who in this world, you know. We have a big file of people, hundreds of people at a time in demonstrations, all of them in full burqa, you know. Not who Westerners think of as being politically involved in environmental, but it's nonsense, of course. These are people who completely understand the threat to their families, their children, their future. Here's a picture that I like. It's from Abu Dhabi, which is a huge oil sheikhdom, and you can see some sheikhs down front. But it's also the home to the largest solar array in the entire world, which was where they did their 350-day event, and it got lots and lots of media across the Middle East, and this is the kind of thing that's beginning to change some of the perceptions in that part of the world. Places I'd never even heard of, you know, and places I had. We're very grateful to everybody who helped out here, and we're going to need your help again. We've spent the last month holed up down in Addison County plotting what comes next in the next year, because Copenhagen, for us, was in many ways a great success for our movement building. We had, by the time that we were done, about 120 national governments that had committed to this very radical 350 target, okay, which was astonishing to see them able to take on the science and to take on the implications of that science. We had governments like the Maldives that were announcing that before the next 10 years are out, they're going to be entirely carbon neutral as societies, okay? So that 120 nations was great, but it was the wrong 120 nations. It was the poor and vulnerable and powerless countries on this planet, and we haven't yet managed to bring down the sort of walls of denial and obstruction in the richest and most powerful countries that produce most of the carbon emissions. So now we're figuring out how to get to work on those places and on those countries together as this next year goes on. And we'll be asking for your help in all of that. And I take it, John, you're being a good organizer that you are, you've got everybody's name and email address who's coming to these things, so we can make sure that we can ask you in very direct terms to come help us. I'm going to turn the microphone now over to, I think Jamie is going to come up first, who not only coordinated much of Asia for us, but also was in charge of the quite astonishing press operation that I was describing before. And Jamie, you have to hit the arrow to make the next picture come up.
Or the space bar bell. So we're gonna try and fly through our team, and it's actually really fun for us because for most of the year we were spread out all across the globe in different places. So it's been great for us to kind of have a homecoming to Vermont for the last few weeks and get to hang out and plan stuff together. And I think this is our first public presentation we've ever done together, all together. It's fun. So each of us wants to tell a very quick story that we really like from the campaign to kind of give you a sense of what stories were out there. And there were hundreds of them, but we picked out 7 that we thought were iconic to really talk about different pieces of the campaign in different regions of the world. So this is a photo that came in from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And this photo came in a really interesting way. And we were all in New York City, as Bill was saying, at the end of the event, trying to kind of figure out how can we take these 5,000 events around the world and get them on the evening news, get these photos out to the entire planet. And we were calling through organizers to try and figure out which are some of the iconic events around the world that we can kind of seed to the media to profile, you know, our top 10 most iconic actions. And my buddy Adam, who is from South Africa but was with us in New York and was helping us out with African media coverage, was calling through some of the organizers, and he ended up calling these 2 young women in Addis who had gone to a training with Phil in South Africa to kind of ask them, we hadn't heard from them for about a month, about kind of what they were planning on doing. And he gets on Skype and he calls their cell phone and he gets this scratchy connection through, and they say, oh yeah, we're thinking of having 15,000 school children in the streets tomorrow. And he's like, what? You know, like, we haven't heard from you in weeks, and all of a sudden there's 15,000 say, oh yeah, we've been going school to school, and there are 15 schools, and we got each of them to commit to bring 1,000 students, so we're gonna have 15,000 people. And it was just like, oh my word, and this was gonna happen on a Friday, so it was perfect timing for us to really kick off the event. So I, with my media hat on, was like, yes, CNN, here we come. And so Adam asked, hey, well, do you have someone to take a photo or get a video of it so that we can get this footage to New York and blast it out? And said, oh no, we hadn't really thought about that. And so I am like breaking down in this New York office at 3 a.m. in the morning. And Adam gets on the phone, and this is kind of the example of what's now possible. He calls up his father, who worked in South Africa making documentaries, who had a friend whose son's girlfriend happened to be in Addis Ababa and happened to have a nice camera. And we find her, and Adam calls her, and she's like, well, great, I can shoot the footage maybe, but how am I going to get it out of Addis? There's no real internet. And so we're like, all right, maybe we can fly the tape to, you know, Nairobi, and then we'll fly it from there. We call Ethiopian television, and they quickly got on to us, and they're like, well, it'll be $30,000 if you want to do this. We're like, oh, no, can't do that. So finally we figure out there's one place that has high-speed internet in Addis Ababa. So this girl goes out on her bicycle the next morning, on her bicycle with her camera, shoots all this great footage, gets back on her bike, bikes across Addis to the one 5-star hotel, has to go into the hotel, buy a drink at the bar so she can use the internet, uploads us footage to New York, and 4 hours later it's going to CNN. That's the type of thing that's now possible with the tools that we have. The mix of bicycles and internet and photos and email and Skype and cell phones, pulling that together is what made this day possible, and also the rest of the stories that these guys are going to share.
So this next story is sort of to contrast the 15,000 youth in Ethiopia. This is one of maybe the more powerful photos that a lot of people were inspired by from October 24th. And this is the one and only organizer in Iraq on October 24th. You saw in many of the photos, there were a lot of unlikely places involved in the 350 campaign, and this is perhaps one of the most unlikely of them all. And her name is Ola, and she found us. I don't actually know how, but she found us at some point during the campaign, signed up on the 350 website, and between myself and our team who was working in Lebanon, we had some great partners in Beirut, the IndiAct organization who helped coordinate a lot of the actions across the Arab world. We got in touch with her, and it was an interesting experience of talking with her about organizing in Iraq, because she said, first of all, she was an extremely shy person, was very quiet on the phone, very short emails, perhaps because her English wasn't too great. She really didn't know what to do. She went and talked to just about all her friends and discovered that everyone was a little nervous to be a part of something like this. She's in a part of the world that has some oil interests, as you might be aware. So she really had a hard time, but in the end, she was not going to give up. And despite the frustrations of having just sort of struggling along, she decided she was going to get out there and be a part of this global day of action, no matter what it took. And so she got out there, found at least somebody to take the photo. I don't know who that was. And and this story also went around the world. And now Ola she's going to continue on. She's going to start with one person and see where it can take her. But this was just a beautiful example of all different unlikely parts of the world. People care about this, and they're trying to figure out some way to get it started. And these are the type of people we're connected to. And amazingly enough, a few weeks later, when we had all gone to Copenhagen, she had found herself there as well. Despite the visa troubles, despite everything else, she found her way there so she could directly input her own story into that debate. So we're a part of this movement with a lot of powerful and amazing people. And now I can pass it over.
Thanks, Will. This is one of my favorite photos. This spans 3 different countries, and it's an unlikely alliance that sort of created this this Scrabble across the Dead Sea. Again, we were working with our partner Indie Act, a great organization out of Lebanon, and we got in touch with some groups in Jordan, and we got in touch with some groups in Palestine, but neither of them really wanted to talk to the groups that we were working to in Israel. So I ended up having to go to Israel and talk to them because Israel is sort of an island in terms of the communications across borders. But in the end, we were able to get some of our partners in Israel in touch with some of the partners in Jordan and in touch with the partners in Palestine, and they ended up coordinating. So on the same day, they went out each to their own bank on the banks of the Dead Sea. A sea that is actually shrinking at an incredibly fast rate because of climate change, and is a huge resource for all 3 of these countries. And so they're all really, really concerned about it. And they came together and they created this 3-piece sort of Scrabble of 350. This is Jordan, this is Palestine, and the last one is in Israel. And it wasn't the first time that they'd sort of gotten together and talked to each other about the Dead Sea, but it was one of the first times that they actually worked together to create this artistic symbol that symbolized sort of the alliance, even across cultural, across warring, across all these boundaries, linguistic boundaries. They were able to come together around the issue of climate change, and I think that's a real example of the direction that this whole movement is taking, that it's breaking across boundaries that we never thought were possible to break.
Hi, my name's Kelly, and I'm going to talk about a story that's from a little bit later in the campaign, actually in Copenhagen, and about one of the solutions that we found that was sort of surprising, which was our alliance with some of the most vulnerable countries around the world. When we first started, 350 was sort of nowhere in the debate of the international negotiations. But by Copenhagen, there was a coalition of about 112 countries that were supporting this target. And not really through the organizing work of us necessarily, but sheerly from the scientific reality that for many of these island countries and countries in Africa that are really vulnerable to climate change, 350 really means survival for them. And so, as Bill and many have said, when we first started doing this work, we really didn't know what we were doing in many ways. And that really came through all the way to Copenhagen in some ways, when I found myself in charge of organizing an 1,000-person rally for the president of the Maldives. Needless to say, at age 24, I don't really know how to do advanced work for a president. But luckily, we had a team of about 30 organizers from around the world who are extremely talented, who were all with us there in Copenhagen, who had pulled off October 24th a month earlier and really knew how to rally a crowd and be problem solvers. So we had maybe 3 days to organize this. We had to, like I said, rally 1,000 people in a city where we didn't know anybody. We had to find a teleprompter for the president so he could give his speech and do all the logistics associated. So by that day, we had put in many volunteer hours, placed many phone calls. I found myself in front of a crowd of 1,000 people. We had managed to do it, adjusting the teleprompter for the president, because he happens to be actually my height, or maybe even a little shorter, as I found out, as he had to look up at the glass panels, because I was actually a little bit taller than him. So anyway, at 4:30 p.m. that day, Bill went on stage to give his speech to talk about the story of 350. And I should back up and say that this whole event came about because we had developed this partnership with the president of the Maldives. And he had said that the first thing he wanted to do when he got to Copenhagen was to speak with Bill McKibben in front of a rally to really show the support of civil society for their stronger positions in Copenhagen, because they're one of the smallest countries on the planet, because they recognize the importance of a global network in highlighting their cause. So Bill took the stage. He was planning to talk for about 45 minutes. And a half an hour into his speech, we learned that the president of the Maldives was already 15 minutes late. So I flashed a sign to Bill. I said, "You have 30 minutes more." He was able to fill that space. A half an hour later, we heard again that he was another half an hour late. So through some Herculean effort, Bill was able to find many interesting stories about the 350 campaign, show many more photos. And finally, at 6 p.m., the president showed up, spoke for maybe 5 minutes, I think, something like that, and ended with 1,000 people on their feet chanting 350, which was a really, really exciting and empowering moment. And you know, these are the governments that are telling the truth because their survival depends on it. But because of their relative size and power in the international negotiations, their concerns are often overlooked because the bigger countries are able to, you know, dominate the debate with their concerns of, you know, their own economic security, trade advantage, whatever else. And so we found it was really important to be able to rally to their cause and highlight their voices till the very end. So yeah, that's my story.
Hi guys, my name's May, and I'm a little jealous of these guys because they got to organize in exotic parts of the world and I was the US coordinator. But I'm going to bring it down back to the local level and talk about the town of Traverse City, Michigan, which is actually a lot like Burlington. It's really cold, it's on a beautiful lake, and it has a very, very engaged population of environmental advocates and social justice advocates. And the story of this community is really about how they completely embraced in every way the 350 goal and extended that to all their organizing efforts throughout the community. And it started because, again, Bill gave a very, very rousing speech and packed the auditorium in downtown Traverse City. And within 2 weeks, we got a shipment of TC 350 coffee, microbrewed beer, and like flyers of community events that were happening every single day. So they really took the number and they extended it to include the signs in their streets, the logo for parades. They had folk musicians compose songs about 350. And they really, really embraced the cause. And they took it many steps further. They engaged the 2 senators in Michigan on the topic and really made it about getting the U.S.'s political position on climate change to be much stronger. And they even raised money in the community to send one of their organizers to Copenhagen. And I wanted to talk about this because no matter what we as a team do next and what all of us as organizers are doing, it's about thinking about ways we can absolutely mobilize everyone in our community. And I know everybody thinks about that a lot, but these guys were very inspiring in the way they embraced it and are still going strong. So that's Traverse City. And it's Jeremy.
This is not Traverse City, Michigan anymore. This is in Poznan at the UN meeting that happened the year before Copenhagen. And survival was one of the big campaigns that the international youth ran at that meeting. And basically, I want to tell a bit about the story of the UN. One of my hats was the UN liaison, so I was in charge of making sure everybody had the proper credentials to get into all these meetings and things. But one thing to understand is that the UN was built upon this beautiful notion of planetary cooperation and involvement, and is actually played out in these negotiations as sometimes the most disgusting power play you've ever seen, and like bullying, and it's not a congenial environment for friendly cooperation anymore. Not that it probably ever was, but the UN process on climate change in particular seems to have brought out a lot of self-interest in countries' delegations. And so one of the coolest things that I think we were involved in, along with a lot of the young people who go to these conferences, was changing that tone. So I want to give two quick examples. The first is built upon the shirt that Will is wearing right now, which was an idea from a UK and a German activist who decided that they wanted to start wearing coordinated t-shirts in the meetings. And it was just two of them, much like sort of a lot of our ideas started. Two people with an idea, and they started pitching it around and finding friends and gathering a small amount of resources to make it happen. And by the second Bonn negotiation, which is in the middle of Germany where they have most of these things, there were hundreds of young people wearing these t-shirts. And it didn't in itself do much until we started asking all of the delegates to wear the shirts too. And all of a sudden, because all the young, cool, hip people were doing it, all the delegates wanted to be young, cool, and hip, and also wanted to bring back souvenirs for their family who were, you know, asking for a gift from their travels abroad and stuff. But got to the point where the president, Michael Kludejar, of the half of the negotiations, basically, wore his shirt the day and made an official proclamation that all of the delegates would be allowed to strip off their shirt and tie and put on this t-shirt the next day. And it's just sort of, it's a small thing, but it breaks a lot of the tension and everything that goes with wearing a suit and tie and feeling like you really own it, you know? And so that was a powerful moment, and actually a lot of the delegates came up to us afterwards and said how much they enjoyed it and how much it made them feel like they were part of an inclusive process. So that was powerful and something that the international youth initiated, and we sort of jumped on as something fun and meaningful in the context of these negotiations. The second piece is in Copenhagen, and it's more about the actual power relations. And the fact that these small countries who are fighting for their very survival don't have as big a megaphone as a country like the US. They don't even have enough people on their delegation teams to go to all the meetings that are happening at one time in the negotiations. So they literally cannot keep track of everything going on. And one of the things that was really powerful about the 350 network that we had there was that when Grenada, this small island country, was going to raise the Alliance of Small Island States negotiating position, this was like their big coming out party for their position for all of Copenhagen. They did it in the plenary, which is something like this with, you know, you picture UN General Assembly, all the plaques and the moderator saying, yes, you, Saudi Arabia, please speak, and you, Canada, please speak next. It's really boring. But directly after that, they came out of the room, and within 10 minutes of them telling us that they were going to do this, Jamie had cobbled together, as, I don't know, media crew of like 20 or so video cameras. Will and Kelly and Phil and John had cobbled together 50 young people and activists from inside the conference center. Somebody else had cobbled together a little stealthily some 350 signs that may or may not have found their way into negotiating floors where they weren't supposed to be advocating directly. But all of that came together within that 10 minutes for them to hold a press conference, and all of a sudden Grenada, who is a small island country, has an activist force of 50 or 100 people behind them, 20 video cameras in front of them, and has a global platform to tell their story. And that was an amazing moment, and shows sort of the ability of grassroots networks to support the champions, the people that we think are really raising our voice inside the negotiations. So that was a fun moment. John, you don't have a photo.
So I'm John. I'm the web guy. Being the web guy, it's a little embarrassing to have my screen be totally blank. But before I dive into my 350 solution story, I want to talk for a minute about, I guess, the internet. It's my geeky obligation to talk about the internet. And maybe more specifically related to what John Isham was saying, talk about the internet as a potentially revolutionary platform. And just that in the fact that in the last decade or so, all of our lives have been profoundly transformed by this medium. Every aspect of almost of our daily lives. It's really been the great modern revolution of our times. So I wanted to dive into that just a little bit with a couple quick examples from our 350 organizing experience. And I guess the first thing I should show is, in being the web guy, a screenshot. Do you guys know Ashton Kutcher? He made his career dating an older woman and, basically pulling off juvenile pranks. But Ashton Kutcher happens to have the most followers of anybody on Twitter. He has almost 4 million followers. So when Ashton says something, a lot of people pay attention, and a lot of people rebroadcast what he has said. So on our big day of climate action, October 24th, as all these photos are pouring in, we're noticing that we're not getting quite as much traction as we would have liked to see in the online world. Blogs aren't covering us as much as we wanted. It's not that big in Facebook or in Twitter, and so what we decide to do is proactively work on this. And this is a moment where I have to honor Joe Solomon, who's sitting in the back there, who looks like you and I, but he is a social media superhero. He's dressed in plain clothes, but totally different kind of guy. So Joe gets to work in figuring out how to really start this flywheel effect of getting the 350 message out and online. So Ashton Kutcher retweeted NY Times Christoph, Nick Christoph, who also happens to have about 1.5 million followers. So this message starts to spread in a big way, and it's hard to measure, but I'm guessing that of those 4 million followers and the cascades of followers, some people found out about 350 for the first time on October 24th, went to our website, found a local event, and attended. That's what I like to think, at least. But the key thing to remember here is that the internet is a revolutionary platform, but the end of that revolution story is not written. And so I would like to posit that the happy ending for that revolution is when the internet is used to facilitate genuine human connection and offline action. And that's why my next photo is an actual photo. Tuvalu is a country that its highest point is 15 feet above sea level. 15 feet. That's like 2 Shaquille O'Neals stacked on top of each other. So as these guys alluded to, a lot of the smaller countries, the less powerful countries, were getting bullied around in the Copenhagen negotiations. But Tuvalu, at a certain point, thanks to the hard work of a lot of people all around the world, started to realize there was a movement behind them and started to feel empowered to take a stronger stand. So at a certain point in the negotiations, they put their foot down. They say, the way you're gutting this treaty, you're taking out the meaningful targets, we can't abide by that. And so they take a stand, and basically negotiations are frozen. And a lot of people are putting pressure on Tuvalu to sort of just cave in and let the US, China just roll over them. And they stay pretty strong. And one of the reasons they stay strong is we start to tell the delegates of Tuvalu, listen, you've got a movement behind you. People are starting to talk about this. So we put out the message on Twitter about what's going on. We're sort of keeping people updated as the negotiations proceed. And people start to write back. They say, we stand with Tuvalu. And this is all well and good. They're writing back online, but what real influence does that have in the negotiations? So one of the things we like to think about is the online to offline cycle, how online action can facilitate offline action, and offline action can feed in to online action. And that's why I really like this last slide. Do you guys know what a hashtag is on Twitter? It's a word preceded by a pound sign. And it basically indicates that it's a big keyword. A lot of people are tracking one particular topic, and you can click on that hashtag and see all the conversations that are happening about that topic. So hashtags exist to allow people to aggregate a lot of momentum and a lot of individual action. But this, I think, is the first time that a hashtag has gone from the online world, from people's computer screens, to the offline world. This is my favorite sign from this whole protest. So I'll end it there, but I'll just say that as we all sort of are the captains of this internet revolution, we should think about how we can use it to facilitate offline action and real human connection.
Great. So we wanted to open it up to question, answer, discussion. And what I'm going to do is kind of play moderator and take 3 questions at a time, and hopefully they'll be in the form of a question. And then we will kind of field it to the staff, and to Bill is available as well. But first off, it's just important again to emphasize over and over that we really are a very small part of this. You know, we had 30 full-time staff around the world, thousands of volunteers, people in this room who did incredible work. Joe, Natalie, Brittany, are you guys here? Do you want to stand up quickly? Don't be embarrassed. We have to stand here. These guys worked really closely with us at the beginning of the campaign. I think Brittany might have organized one of the first ever 350 rallies in the world that kicked this whole thing off. So, questions?
Reiterate, you guys are awesome for the web folk. So my question was, so Naomi Klein recently said that a particular model of dealing with climate change is dying. And I'm taking that to mean that she's looking for people to work more outside of the system and not so much with corporations and working with groups that could be considered inside of the system. Especially after looking at the recent Supreme Court decision, I'm interested in what your guys' take is on that stance, I guess.
2 more. We'll do 2 more. Yes. So the microphone is tied to the video camera, which is why we're...
Cool. All right. Well, obviously, I'd like to reiterate what Keith said, but in the interest of time, I'm just gonna. You guys talked a little bit about the arts position, basically, in this movement, and as somebody who doesn't really have the space in my degree to be an art major, my question would be, how can I get involved artistically in this movement?
Great. 1 more? Yes.
I'm really interested in the celebrity aspect of this movement, especially after seeing the Twitter post from Ashton Kutcher and how the internet guy said that generated so much feedback and more people he thinks joining into the movement. But then I heard somebody else say that they didn't want celebrities on, the 350 day because they thought it would take away from the human aspect and the more, down-to-earth aspect of the movement. So I don't know if you guys are planning on or trying to get more celebrities involved, and why or why not, and what you think that'll do for the movement.
Volunteers. Corporations, art, celebrities.
I can talk about a couple of those things, and then other people can chime in, especially Kelly, who really did immense amount of the arts organizing. It's funny. Naomi Klein and Naomi Klein and I are having dinner in Copenhagen when somebody's BlackBerry went off with the news that essentially the whole meeting had gone south and that the U.S. had struck its own deal and things. And we immediately retreated to, what was the name of that place? The Fresh Air Center that someone had set up as this like blogging thing. And she and I gave this kind of impromptu half-hour colloquy back and forth. It's an extremely... I think what she's talking about, and I think what we're talking about, is the understanding that we can't rely on what's constituted the environmental movement in the past to be the kind of vanguard of all of this. It's not, among other things, it's not big enough, The Sierra Club, all those things were set up to deal with passing the Endangered Species Act or protecting the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. These have been hard fights that we've barely won, but they haven't been fights that went to the center of the world's economy. It's too much to expect the National Wildlife Federation to, beat ExxonMobil. Okay, it's just not. It's it's like having it's like having World War II and deciding that the Red Cross will be your main army or something. You're just going to get beaten. And one of the things that happens when you don't have much power is that those environmental groups have tended to compromise very easily and try to find the quickest possible. So that's the reason we need more movement going behind them, and around them to really make things happen. Now, some of that will be with business and things. We're not going to solve this problem either. One of the interesting things about global warming is there's a time limit to how long we have to solve it. Okay, it's not like we have 50 years in which we get to rebuild the whole world's economic system in some other frame and then go around solving. We don't have that time. We work with the institutions we've got. We work with Christianity more or less as it is. We work with capitalism more or less as it is. But the kind of changes that we're going to need to make will fundamentally rework those things. If we get a price on carbon, which is what all the political work is about, then corporations will be different things a few years down the road. The world looks the way it does right now, I think, and Bob can talk more about this, and John in sense than I can, but I think the world looks the way it does right now because we've had such an abundance of cheap fossil fuel for so long. And if we can build the political momentum to raise the price of that fossil fuel, then the world will begin to look different. That means all kinds of organizing. It means civil disobedience. It also means cooperating where it's possible with big forces. It means real nimbleness in a lot of ways, and this goes to this question of celebrities too. What we were worried about is that in the past, there's been this tendency to sort of put movie stars front and center as the kind of spokesman for that, and that's what some of the big environmental groups have done. They've each got their own movie star sort of in-house, you know, that supports their community. And the result of that has often been, I think, to have people think, huh, you know, I like Leonardo DiCaprio, but I don't actually believe that he knows an immense amount about atmospheric physics, you know, and so I'm not certain that I should change my, you know, way of life, whatever, to, you know, because, I mean, he said, the weakness of that kind of thing is that it can trivialize stuff. So we tried very hard to make the number the center of everything we did, this very hard piece of science. But then, once things were going, like Ashton Kutcher did that late in the day, right? We'd already had most of the events that we were doing, at which point to sort of build the buzz around it and things, it was very useful. So we try to some degree to have it all ways, and that's that kind of nimbleness that we're talking about. And Kelly, can you talk about arts arena? Because that was the other thing that I've long thought that the environmental movement was much too, I can never remember which is it right brain or left brain that thinks serious, straightforward thoughts. Well, whatever the one is that thinks that graphs are the best way to communicate things has been very much the environmental movement for a long time. And so we tried very hard and continue to try very hard to make music, art, whatever part, half of the brain they come from, do carry some of the weight. And Kelly did a lot of that.
With a lot of help. But yeah, we did reach out to artists a whole lot with the 350 campaign. Not just visual artists, but also poets and musicians. Musicians wrote songs. We had one initiative where 350 poets submitted poems of 3.5 lines each, which was pretty exciting. And really, I mean, a lot of the events were very artistic in themselves. You saw all those formations of human 350s and like suns and all these different sort of shapes out of people on that day. And we really took that tack because we felt like the visual and the artistic was a really good way to explain to people this abstract number and problem, and to bring a lot of new people in. It was something fun and creative and different that people could do. So we had a lot of different projects that sort of sparked people's interest, but we really just left it open for people's sort of creativity to run wild. So I don't know, I guess my suggestion to you would just be to, you know, think about what kind of art you like to do, talk with people in your community. I think the most successful projects that we saw were really ones that were done with a community or a group of people, sometimes in one place, but sometimes spread out around the whole world. We did one project in particular where we asked people to send in on the back of postcards why it was important for them to reach 350. And people made collages and, you know, wrote about their grandchildren and did any number of sort of creative response. And we created a wall on our website where people could go visit those sorts of things. And it helped knit people together from all over the world and, you know, why they cared about this movement. Yeah.
You also had it where you could submit your art into a gallery.
Yes, we did.
I thought that was great.
Yeah, we really left it open, and Cammie here is a local artist on has helped. But you worked with us on the march, right? And so she would definitely be a great person to talk with as well. So yeah, that's the artistic engagement aspect.
Cool. More questions. Hold on, I'm gonna.
I guess this is mainly for Bill, but Bill and Peter Barnes have an article in the first issue of Solutions, if you go online and look at that, on the cap and dividend system. And that's actually manifest these days in the Collins-Cantwell bill that's currently in Congress. I think that initiative could use some support. Is 350.org, and this is certainly a way to get to 350. A solution to the problem. Is the 350.org group going to get behind that initiative, or do you have any plans for how to sort of support that act that is now the Clear Act that's now in Congress?
Great. Cap and dividend. Another question? This is easy for me.
I think the follow-on to that is stepping back more broadly, is what is the role of the movement, and what is the role of the movement on the ground versus the role of the movement of people in Washington, D.C. working on policy, and where is the intersection of policy and the movement happen?
I'm interested, you painted this picture of everyone in the whole world working together very, very well. I'm wondering what cultural boundaries you came across and perhaps you weren't expecting, and like kind of lessons for interacting in this global way, perhaps failures of the movement, and points where maybe this model might not work. I'm not sure what they are, if they'd exist. Maybe everyone really can work together perfectly. But yeah, the applicability of this kind of organizing and other kinds, and just how we can work together as a globe.
We're perfect. That's it. No.
So I can attempt to tackle the first two together, and Bill can talk about it too, but we've been talking a lot about the cap and dividend approach while we've been together, and how many people here are familiar with what this basically means? Okay, great. And part of the reason we think it's so interesting is precisely to Jay's point, which is this is an example of a political solution and a policy solution that can really motivate individual people wherever they are. And so we think it has a lot of merit, specifically in this period where we find ourselves in the U.S., where there's so much populist sentiment. But I don't know about you guys, but I feel like populism has come to mean something that the right wing has been sort of taking as their definition. I think cap and dividend is a populist solution that is much more broad and much more progressive. And so we like it for that reason. I think it's pro-people. It's not for Wall Street. It's for individual people. And moreover, that it connects individual Americans to this idea that the solutions to climate change are going to help them. And while it does require sacrifice, especially this fact that the United States emits far more per capita than any other country, but I think if we're going to get the United States really to motivate to do something serious about climate change, individual Americans have to feel really bought into that idea. And so I think cap and dividend of any of these potential solutions has that merit. So we've been thinking about what sort of campaigning would look like with a lot of, there were 2,000 events in the U.S. on October 24th. So that represents, in some ways, 2,000 community groups around the country who are motivated and ready to go. So that's definitely something that we're really interested in working on. And I think the reason we're thinking about it in terms of those 2,000 groups is Washington is not really giving us what we want right now. And, that's for a lot of reasons. But the thing that we can all control, and we collectively, is our own organizing. And so the organizing absolutely has to happen in individual states and individual cities. And that's why I think the power is coming from outside of Washington, and why cap and dividend in particular has the right ingredient to really get grassroots support. And Phil can talk about cultural barriers.
Yep. Thanks, May. We're matching. So yeah, we are matching. So I was, believe it or not, charged with organizing both Africa and the Middle East, which was really interesting. And I learned a lot of lessons. One of them, and I think this speaks a lot to the question, which is like the replicability of what we do. A lot of what we do is sort of work on the fly. We're really flexible. We set up a system in which people could organize any kind of action they wanted as long as it had the number 350 in it. So in that frame, I think we can look at the the 350 campaign is a very sort of, we call it open source, or actually John Isham coined that term, open source organizing. And we take that pretty seriously. We want to leave open doors instead of like channeling people to ways that we want them to take action. But we also want them to do it in a way that we can aggregate it easily and bring it to Copenhagen and things like that. One of the things that I sort of realized early on was that, you know, I might be really great at organizing people in Boston or Washington, D.C., or where I grew up in New Jersey, but I wasn't going to be that good at organizing people in Addis Ababa for a variety of reasons. And so early on in the campaign, we decided, okay, we have this great sort of like open source model. How do we sort of get people to own it in a more robust way so that they feel like they had a reason to take action, and they had trust in us that we would take their message to the leaders, and that we had trust in them that they would, you know, use the limited resources that we had available to take action on the ground. And we found that bringing together these trainings, these sort of conferences where people could sort of workshop with each other and sort of build leadership skills that they needed to take action in their own communities, whether it was on climate or anything else, they would find that really valuable. And so a lot of our way of sort of overcoming some of those very real sort of cultural and linguistic differences was to build that trust. And frankly, a lot of that trust comes from not having a lot of resources, right? If you don't have a lot of resources and the person, you know, on the other side of the ocean doesn't have a lot of resources either, then there's a built-in trust there that you can't get if, you know, I have $1 million and I'm not going to give it to somebody in Africa. I think that often is a barrier. So we didn't have much in terms of money to give, but we did have a lot in terms of the kind of leadership and convening kind of skills that we used. So we had these a couple trainings. We had one in Johannesburg. We had one in Turkey last summer. We had one a couple in India that we were at. And Jamie had one in Bangkok, and it really provided a way for people to network with each other, sort of like horizontal communication rather than sort of like the top-down kind of stuff. And that, you know, if you look at sort of economic development models and the stuff that USAID and a lot of these groups are doing, it strikes me more like charity than it is solidarity. And I think we came to them, these folks, you know, in terms of solidarity, and they understood that in a really important way, and were able to take that forward and overcame some of those cultural barriers that way.
Cool. I think we have time just for 3 more quick questions. So anybody in the back of the room or in the middle of the room? Let's pass it back.
So you talked about how you went to different countries and around the world to set up these trainings and things like that. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate on like how you achieved that. Like, how did people know about the trainings? How did you get them to come? How did you decide where a good place to hold them would be? Just things like that.
Great. Any more questions around that area?
Yeah, how do you actually plan to enforce countries to stick to this agreement? I mean, if there's no super body basically telling other countries they have to go along with it, they can basically just flip you the bird and say, I'm not going to go along with it. And if you don't get countries like China or the United States to follow up with it, how do you actually prevent global climate change?
So you already spoken about one aspect of climate justice, which is the issue that there are some countries that will be more negatively impacted than others, and a lot of those are the poorest countries in the world. There's also the issue that most of the carbon in the atmosphere was put there by industrialized nations, and so there's a sort of implicit critique in a call for a target of 350 parts per million, which is that we need to require countries that already have a lot to slow down, but also that countries that don't have much can't expect the same growth trajectory that we have in terms of carbon emissions. And I'd like to know how, as a campaign, you've tried to frame that issue, that part of the climate justice issue, because that's something that's very different in a global perspective, depending on where you sit.
So, organizing, enforcement, climate debt.
So great question, and it's true. There's no easy way to enforce a treaty that came out of Copenhagen or will come out of the UN process further down the line. I think our answer, or at least my answer, is that the best way to enforce it is with a robust and powerful political movement. I think that there is going to be that problem of implementation, and the way to ensure that it's implemented is to make sure that there are people being held accountable. And to hold people accountable, you have to have people holding them accountable, and those are the people we want to organize. So that's the sort of simple equation to it. Another piece of it that I think we're excited to focus on more this year is pushing more of the national policies. We made sort of a massive Hail Mary pass at Copenhagen with 350, and it worked out to the degree that we could influence the process. I think it sort of blew us away how much we got this number into the debate and how much we were able to shift things. But I think going forward, especially after the disappointment of Copenhagen, there's going to be a lot more of an excitement to engage in national political struggles and to really build up the power and accountability in a lot of the countries that will be using a lot of their power to influence the UN process. So I talked before about how it's sort of a weird power play in this beautiful conception of a united world. We're excited and looking into a lot of the countries that have a lot of the both upfront power, like US and China, and also sort of the swing power. One that came out of Copenhagen was this basic block of Brazil, South Africa, India, China. And playing those national policies and other groups of countries that have the ability to influence that process on a national level, I think will be a stronger way to get at the accountability than just saying, UN, do this, and figure out some way to make it happen. Having the people on the ground to make it happen at a national level will ensure that it actually happens.
I'm going to try to touch on the other two questions really briefly since we have to wrap up, and I'll give Bill the final words. So the question about how we actually went about organizing some of these workshops and trainings, it was kind of just a mix of many opportunities that involved some brunt work from ourselves and also what we found sort of offered to us and available to us. Some of the time it involved, like Phil really took the leadership to identify the need for some way to bring youth together in Africa, and he went out and sought funders to help support that. In other circumstances, it was actually funders who learned about the work we were doing and offered us venues in which we could actually work to bring other youth and people together to do these sorts of trainings. And the third sort of category of times when it took place was when young people themselves were organizing to bring themselves together, and because of their connection to the 350 campaign that they were helping to lead in that part of the world, they asked us to come help with sort of strengthening those efforts. So it really was a matter of us sort of staying nimble and flexible, as we've sort of said before, to see what opportunities are available and then just running with them whenever possible with very limited resources. So we can get a lot more detail if you want, but that's the sort of overview. And the question you've raised is certainly one of the hardest ones, I think. Something that we definitely discuss and are challenged by ourselves. That said, I think we've learned a lot this year about the real possibility and the hope for low carbon development pathways that really don't involve the same sort of development trajectories that the Western world really experienced, the high carbon intensity development pathways. And recognizing that those low carbon development pathways might actually have much greater greater opportunities associated with them than the sort of society we've created for ourselves. Some of this relates to some of the sort of the work that Bill has written about deep economy and sort of what true happiness is at a local level, what is both sustainable and enriching to communities isn't necessarily high energy intensity. It's actually other things like community and good food and other ways to develop. And we actually, one of the really exciting examples of a country that's leading in this is a country we've referenced a few times, is the Maldives, where the president of the Maldives he articulated it very well in several speeches he's given this past year when he talked about, it's not coal we want, it's electricity. It's not oil we want, it's transport. And they're very determined to find ways to find the ways in which their society can exist and develop and really provide equal opportunity to all people in a way that doesn't destroy their own survival. And there's a real recognition that we can't do everything and still maintain a planet that's livable for everyone. The science is sort of the bottom line, and from there, we're going to figure out ways to create opportunities for everyone.
And I'll just wrap up very quickly by saying that last set of questions is incredibly deep and meaty about development and the developing world. The fact that we allowed the gulf that there is in this between rich and poor, as I said earlier, is, it's been a sin for a very long time. It's also an incredible practical impediment to taking action now on the biggest problem we've ever faced. And one of the most moving things about Copenhagen was watching the number of countries around the world, poor developing countries, who pretty much not waved off, but didn't bow down before the West when they appeared with promises of money in the future. Hillary Clinton said, we'll have $100 billion for you some indeterminate date in the future. And the sort of idea is everybody, okay, then that's good, we'll take it. What they'd understood, in part through the work that we and others were doing about the science, was there's no amount of money on earth that helps me if my country is underwater, if all my pasture is turned to desert, if my entire, you can build me a hospital, but if that hospital is completely filled with people who all of a sudden are catching dengue fever, then I haven't gotten anywhere in the first place, And their demand that Western countries actually cut their emissions was one of the things that kind of blew up the meeting, that made the U.S., okay, we can't deal with this, so we're taking our, meeting and going home. That's going to be the most difficult, interesting, fruitful place in which to work. It's why we're so committed to this global scale of organizing. And I just want to end by saying, for all of you who are, students here or whatever, you've seen us now. We're a fairly scruffy lot. 3 or 4 years ago, we had absolutely no idea how to do any of this. We've learned how to do it. We've been very ambitious. And worked incredibly hard. They've worked considerably harder than I have. And the key thing, I think, that it turns out to being a great organizer, to allowing this kind of organizing to happen, well, there's a number of things. You have to have a sharp idea and a sort of strategy and all that. But you also, at some level, have to be open, friendly, able to engage with everybody where they are. That's what it's about. Not insist on your particular lifestyle or your particular, cultural revolution, or everybody has to be a vegan, or you have to be able to engage with people where they are, deal with who everybody is, and work from there. And when you do that, some of this sentimental stuff that we always tell each other about how everybody is sort of alike underneath, whatever, actually turns out to be true. It was unbelievably moving to sit in that office that day, that 36 or 48 hours in New York, and watch these pictures flood in from all over the world and see that no matter where they, I mean, some of them were things that would just break your heart. You know, we were getting these pictures from, there's some orphanage in Indonesia where hundreds of the orphans had gone out and collected thousands of plastic bottles and made a huge 350 with them. And they wrote this note in sort of broken English saying, even though no one caring about us, we caring about the earth, you know. I mean, just things like, really, we were in tears more than once in the course of this thing. To understand that at a certain level, despite all the incredible political, socioeconomic, demographic, religious, ideological gulfs that there are a certain number of ways in which we truly are intrinsically alike, and one of them is this deep and devout hope for some kind of future. And that we've been able to one degree or another, incarnate that future in a number and then in a movement, makes it, you know, kind of possible to imagine that kind of global work. So far, it's very much at the beginning. There's lots and lots and lots of work for all of you to do to help make this happen. We're glad that we've got all your email addresses now. Trust me, you will hear from us. And that's precisely how this kind of work magnifies and ramifies and grows. Everybody in this room now has 10 times more connections around the world than the most connected person on Earth had 20 years ago. Your email inbox address book provides, with one jump or two jumps, you know, connections all over the planet. We need those. We need you. We need this kind of work. We're very grateful to have you as colleagues and allies going forward. There will be lots of fun in the next year as we figure out how to do this. So thank you all very, very much.
And thank you all. Really amazing.